Oh my God, I have to repeat all of that because it was not audible on Zoom. Okay, well, everyone, welcome. And welcome to David Singh Grewal, who's joining us from California, Berkeley. I was wondering why he wasn't reacting to what I was saying. David is a professor of law at University of California, Berkeley, a political theorist, and most importantly, a dissertation supervisor to me. So, welcome, and the panel has Christina, Roni, Robert Weber, and Onur. I'll hand it over to Roni to call on the panelists, and we'll take it from there. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for showing up on a Saturday, this late stage in the conference, and right after lunch. Our panel is called Money In and Out of Economics. I'm not sure it's that helpful, the title. Anyway, when we set up the panel, me and Christina, we wanted to look at sites that showcase the so-called distinction between finance and the real economy, and the cost of ignoring finance when you do economics, but also the cost of even supposing there is a distinction. So we wanted to suggest one of these costs was a process of depoliticization, ignoring the role of institutions, the facticity of money and instability of credit, the role of power asymmetries within and between countries, and the state's authority to intervene directly in the economy. So the papers we have cover about a century and a half, and they look at interest in 19th-century political economy and sovereign debt in the 80s. And we are looking actually at two moments in the history of the Federal Reserve as a business cycle and crisis manager on either end of the 20th century. And we're hopefully going in chronological order, which means I'm starting. So I'm going to move over there and keep talking from over there. My name is Roni Hirsch, and I'm an assistant professor of government and political theory at Piper University. Should we move down? Yeah, move down. Can everyone hear me okay? No. Is this better? Yeah, okay. All right, so this is a different title than the one promised in my abstract, and I'm still not quite pleased with it. It's called Waiting for Profit, Abstinence and Depoliticization of Interest in the 19th Century. So, not working. Great. So this comes out of my book project as a chapter of my book, and the book is a intellectual history of the concept of profit, with two main aims. The first aim is to just comparatively look at different definitions. So this is a history that runs from Adam Smith to Frank Knight. There's reasons for this specific choice. I won't get into it. I'm a political theorist. I want to compare different models of profit and classify them based on basically justifications for inequality or justifications for profit, which is more or less the same thing. So several famous models include profit is a return on weighting, a return on enterprise, a return on innovation, on uncertainty bearing, and of course on exploitation. Well, not really a return on exploitation, it's something quite different. The second thing I'm interested in the book is to understand how we moved from an idea of profit as a limited regular return on capital investment to an unlimited residual, so roughly Smith versus Knight. Within this book, today I'm going to talk about my weighting chapter, but I want to use it to highlight a methodological question that I think is more relevant to this audience, and that is, what's the place of actual financial history when we write intellectual history? And profit and interest, comprise a unique kind of site for thinking about this question because, at least the way I see it, the main project of political economy, the way Smith sees it, is precisely to take something like profit or interest. Smith doesn't do it with interest, he just does it with profit. Take it out of its old context within kind of a financial or commercial world and to turn it into a political economic construct, a real economics variable. This is very important to me because I think Smith has a lot of critique, obviously, of the mercantilist system. So for him to keep profit, which he's quite critical of, is really a lever to his broader reform efforts. In other words, he's critical of profit, of high profit specifically. He's keeping profit, and by changing profit, he's proposing a broader economic reform. That's in very broad lines. I think interest is even more interesting in this regard. It's a concept that's harder to detach from its original context. It's more embedded in the financial environment from which it comes from. So I want to look a bit at some of how that plays out. So what's happening with interest in classical political economy, specifically in the work of John Stuart Mill and a bit Senor and John Ray, was an obscure figure I would never have heard of if I hadn't read Mill's extended block quotes from him. And he's actually, it took me a while to realize Mill is doing something different with Ray's ideas than what Ray was doing. And so the book chapter really looks at comparatively at these two different theories of interest as a return on weighting. And sorry, my time is on the computer and the computer keeps turning off. So, okay. So basically, when Smith makes profit into a real economic variable, it says profit is a return for risk and trouble. We won't get into this. 19th century, now profit is the return for risk, trouble, and time. So the way the chapter looks at what is being done with interest, it's looking at interest as really this new variable that explains a component of profit, which is simply a return on time, making time into an economic variable, and counting on better visibility of the text. It's a bit hard to read from here, but this is kind of Senor, and it's a long quote, so I'll just read the very bottom. Basically, when we consider interest, when we consider time as an economic variable, we need to consider the additional sacrifice made when labor is undergone for a distant object. Right? So an element of prospective thinking, some kind of effort, right? It's an agent distinct from labor and the agency of nature, the concurrence of which is necessary for the existence of capital and which stands in the same relation to profit as labor does to wages. It's a form of cost exertion that merits some kind of return or reward. So that's the basic context. I put this quote here already to again show the way Mill is doing this displacement. So when Mill talks about interest is something that capital bears, not money. That's why this quote is up here, right? So the money carries, so that he's talking about, well, we use money for other things than capital, but even when we use it to repay loan or to pay taxes, money carries its purchasing power with it wherever it goes, right? So this is a kind of an effort, I hope, I've convinced you, an effort to wrest interest from its former association simply with monetary politics. And so the rest of my talk, is in three parts. I want to look a little bit more at these displacements of interest, that is, into the realm of real economics. I want to look at two examples where we see interest reemerge, interest in its classical financial sense reemerge between the lines, and then kind of show that actually these financial realities that are in the background of these theories actually have a lingering hold. So they find their way into real economic explanation. And I think that point is already quite interesting. All right, so the displacements of interest. So if we look at the history of theories of interest, right, there's a lot of talk about the histories of writing about credit, but I haven't found as many histories about interest rates. Right? They seem to be the same thing, but they aren't quite. So when people are trying to explain the interest rate in the 17th, 18th centuries, it's often a supply and demand kind of explanation, loanable funds sort of explanation, and different explanations emphasize more the supply or the demand, but these are the basic, it's kind of a market rate that has to do something with the money supply, with the volume of trade, different kinds of explanations. One of the phenomena that they're trying to explain is why interest rates tend to decline, right? So this is prefiguring the big debates in the 19th century about profit rates declining, and the conversation actually started earlier as a conversation about interest. Right, and it's a set of practical questions that have to do with these broader historical phenomena, so people are trying to understand, should interest be limited by law, or how does interest affect progress, or how does interest affect distribution and thereby progress? So this is a kind of a very quick summary of the kind of literature that is preceding the political economic theory of the interest rate as a purely economic phenomenon. And so we find, and the bulk of my chapter, my apologies to David, are really about this. I'm really trying to understand why time equals money in these theories. I identify two distinct theories, a theory that says we get interest because of waiting itself, and a theory that says that interest is paid for the abstinence involved. So sacrifice versus waiting, I show that these are not the same explanations. I think they're really, really interesting. So I'll just summarize some of the takeaways from this comparative analysis. Basically, what makes interest real for both of these, and I'm talking mostly about Mill and Ray, for both of these economists is, who are writing about roughly 2 decades apart, 1830s versus late 1840s. For both of them, interest significantly interacts with character or mentality, right? So different rates of interest will promote different kinds of people to invest. Because they interact with character, they're also characters for both of these. They're shaped by institutions, norms, and education. So if you want to raise investment levels, basically you have to, the way Mill says it, inculcate new desires in people, right? So it's an educational process. It's unfortunately also a civilizing process. It's very there is a whole anthropological picture, and the key moving concept here is something that Ray came up with, and it's called the effective desire to accumulate. The effective desire to accumulate, that is, if I have a high desire to accumulate, a low interest rate is enough for me to invest. And the idea is that these things are distributed more or less by nation. All right, so the diversity is not great within nations, but between them. I won't even get too much into this comparison, but the idea is that for Ray, the reason I call it a weighting theory of the interest rate is because it gives us an answer what the rate of return in a given society is. Won't get into how that comes about. For Mill, the important question is, what is the ratio between saving and consumption? This is kind of the big question motivating all abstinence theories, where saving really means investment. So are you investing in, are you basically consuming capital productively or unproductively? This distinction is interesting because Mill just cares about something different. Mill is very concerned about basically the problem of wasting resources and efficient use of resources, given that we are all in the shadow of a Malthusian population problem. Right? So for Mill, it's really important to get as much investment in the economy, whereas Ray just has kind of an idea of secular improvement, making way for innovation, a completely different story. And I just wanted to give you a taste of how Ray is thinking about these distinctions. So this is a kind of abominable quote that it's talking about the distinctions between Europeans and Chinese. Chinese are impatient people, very industrious though, right? So they're willing to work, this is all in Ray, willing to work very hard, but they won't work at long-term projects, and that explains the actual differences in materiality. They're going to use materials that are consumed faster and so on, and then they have to keep rebuilding them. It's a whole anthropology that makes use of this idea that the most important element in each society is the fact that desire to accumulate. Okay, I don't want to spend too long on this. So where is the interest still in this story? Basically, the reason I want to talk about the financial background is that there is something that isn't self-evident about the fact that they're even bothering to give an economic explanation to interest, right? They're not, if you look at Adam Smith, when it came to rent, he didn't bother to give an economic explanation of rent. He said rent is a legal convention, right? We pay the rent because someone has enclosed the property. And then Ricardo gives us an economic definition of rent, but I think it's interesting that someone is bothering to give interest and economic explanation. There's also a sense when you read these texts that interest really is just an opportunity cost, right? So it's like whenever we're holding on to capital without investing it, we're losing the interest. And this is something that actually comes up with Mill a few times, right? So this is just an example of the mint. And I liked it just because it has this expression, right? In England, though there is no seigniorage on gold coin, there is a delay of a few weeks after the bullion is deposited before the coin can be obtained, occasioning a loss of interest. So I'm like, okay, interest is in the air, and for time purposes, you'll just have to take my word for it. Another thing, if you look at Ray is basically assuming a kind of compounded interest. So when Ray looks at how capital is productive over time, which is what Ray does to explain interest, you can really see that that kind of capital grows in this exponential way that can only be explained in an environment that has compounded interest. I won't say more on that either. So these are just my clues. Of course, there's a lot of references, especially in Mill, to actual kind of monetary, to various laws and acts that are passing in the 19th century, like the Banking Act and other kinds of, and he talks about those quite extensively. So the finance is in the background. And so where do we see that affecting the theories? Well, one way is, for example, and I'm still waiting to kind of find more evidence of this, but I said, where is this opportunity cost coming from? Well, obviously, one important source is government securities. And if you look at Mill's position on government securities, it's the ultimate form of waste, at least when these government securities are financing war, right? So luxury is wasteful, and that's part of a really long debate in political economy. Luxury for Mill is wasteful, but nothing is more wasteful than putting your money in government debt when that money is going to finance war. Okay, so finance is entering into a kind of this normative position that Mill is presenting. And yeah, I feel I'm really going over time. Really, really important point. Long time debate on Mill's capital fund. A lot of people see Mill as supposing that capital is this fixed, rigid limit on what we can do in the present. The past kind of circumscribes what the means we have available in the present, the means we have available to pay wages, and part of my paper shows that actually Mill is proposing a very flexible idea of the wage fund, and that flexibility relies on two financial instruments, credit, but also the wage contract itself. I really want to expand this idea that wages are used really as an financial instrument in Millen and other people's theories, but I won't get into it now. We can talk about it in the Q&A. So basically my provisional conclusion, right, this is something that came up yesterday. I think Stephanie Kelton said it, right? Capitalism is a financial system, and I would say capitalism is a financial system only if that financial system, only if our explanations can integrate that financial system into the real economic part of our explanation. So the real economic explanation of interest is that it's paid because of the corrosive effects of time, because of mentality, because of human passions. And the real financial explanation of interest in these theories is we need a system to arrange economic activities through time, and we do it through tools of redistribution and reallocation. And another possible takeaway from this is that, at least in classical political economy, finance is seen as a system of organizing time more than a system of organizing risk. And I think that's also an interesting point of comparison. All right, thank you. Oh, I need to present the next speaker. Sorry, I'm also acting chair. So our next speaker is Onur Özgöde. He's an assistant professor of public policy in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at Bilkent University and a senior research fellow at the SDS program here at Harvard.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. Today I will present our paper with Julian Riemeyer on the origins of macroeconomic central banking. This is a project that we came across together with Julian based on our personal projects. I'm currently writing a book for the MIT Press on the rise and transformation of the US macroeconomic state, particularly looking at the problem of systemic risk as the motivating practical problem that motivates the construction of this domain. Julian is working on the transformation of financial regulation in the United States since the 1980s. And this was kind of a sort of an offshoot of our projects to understand the origins of the thing that we have come to study. How did the Fed become what it is today? All right. So the main puzzle that drives this paper is the sort of obvious fact that today's central banks are macroeconomic managers. And yet, if we sort of read into the history of central banks, for instance, Chris's book, which I have been reading for a long time, you see that they did not manage what we today call the economy. In fact, the concept of the economy is very new, therefore they could not have managed something that didn't exist. Instead, they did various other tasks, right? Such as financing wars, I'll get into other tasks that we today did not associate with macroeconomic central bank. And in these kind of periods, when you ask central bankers to manipulate or affect real economic factors, they refuse to do so. So this raises the puzzle, how do they change their mind and come to accept a role that we today associate with them? How was that role itself was constructed? And in this paper, we look at that construction of that role. The argument we make is that this role was constructed as basically a historical accident when central banking came to the United States. And it was constructed as a response to the contentious politics of money in the United States, which was plaguing the United States society since the Civil War, and it was constructed as a survival strategy to survive that political contention the new institution faced when it had to operate for the first time in the wake of World War I. We made three contributions in the paper. The first is that this role that central bankers come to accept as the managing the economy allowed them in the 1970s to turn to the market, right? So Kripnerian argument that the neoliberalism is a turn to the market is predicated upon the possibility of central bankers to accept this role and become the manager of that act of managing the economy through the market. So if the role did not exist, for instance, Martin before Ernst took over, who sort of did this, under Martin's chairmanship in the 1950s and 1960s, you couldn't really imagine this kind of task acceptance. Second, where did open market operations come from? Today, we naturally think central bankers use open market operations to manage the economy. And yet, we know that open market operations was an obscure technique when the technicality when the Federal Reserve Act was written, and it was written as a boundary object that reconciled the interests of all these actors who opposed each other and wanted a different type of central bank. And as far as I know, that no other central bank historically had something like open market operations. The primary tool of central banking was discounting the lending. So where did this technique come from, and how did it result in, how did it contribute to the construction of this new role? So here we sort of try to move beyond the economists' narrative on this episode we study, which is about the brilliance of Benjamin Strong and this miraculous discovery of the effectiveness of central bankers, open market operations, effectiveness on real economic outcomes. We argue that instead it's better to think about this moment as a way of organizational innovation in a response to a survival problem that the Fed was facing in the early 1920s. And finally, we placed the Fed in the wider American political economy upon the calling of economic sociologist Monica Prasad. So of course, many other people are engaging with that, but in particularly what we're doing is, first of all, we're showing the role of institutional economists in this story and the unacknowledged responsibility they have in this project. And we sort of start to put emphasis on the domestic issues that weighed on the Fed at the time, not so much international ones, such as the reconstruction of the gold standard, which is sort of the standard story currently in the literature. And the payoff for this is obviously is a focus on the open market operations test and a new genealogy of the economy that is distinct from one that is about history of macroeconomics, one that is more about the practices of using open market operations to manage the economy. So if we were to sort of analytically distinguish between different roles, right? Traditionally, central banks were bankers' banks, which effectively ruled, were used to manage bankers' risks, often at the expense of society, right? So the whole idea of liquidationism was basically make sure that bankers, after a crisis, had good counterparties, which obviously was not ideal for those who became unemployed, whose companies got bankrupt. Alternatively, you have this German tradition of developmental central banking, where the credit tools of the central bank can be used for industrialization purposes. And finally, more later, with its sort of older precedents, you have this notion of the fiscal agent, right? That the central bank can act to support the government policies in various ways. So we think that it's fair to think of those as those dominant traditional roles. Whereas modern roles, we often associate central banks with inflation manager, and that has become sort of the focus of the critical literature on central banking and social sciences. But more recently, people like Van Steven and others have come to acknowledge that central banks also do macroeconomic management, which complicates this sort of moral left-wingy story that has been the sort of focus on traditional roles. So for our question was, how can we think about this macroeconomic management role in relationship to older roles? If we were to think of this history as a sort of recombinatorial history where the elements of older modalities are taken and recombined into a new role, where were these elements coming from? And most importantly here, what we highlighted, with bolded and italicized, right? So first of all, the logic is hybrid, just like in the developmental agency position, where it's a public-private partnership, right? From the very beginning, the dominant logic, especially in the German case, has been to sort of use the resources of the private and under the direction of the public for the public good. In terms of the object of intervention, it is the money market, which comes from the banker's bank role. And finally, open market operations, which is sort of this distinctive notion or this element, which basically just emerges once this developmental agency role is brought into the United States, especially at the New York Fed, and used for supporting dealers. Right? So, but only as a secondary tool, not as the primary tool. So for the macroeconomic manager role to emerge, you need that open market operations element to become the primary tool. So when did that happen? And that is what our paper is about. All right, so the first decade of the Fed, or is sort of from the crisis that led to the Fed's creation in 1907 panic to 1919, which will result into another crisis. We had four different actors or parties that are struggling over what the Fed should be. First, we have the Paul Warburg, the investment banker, who's the founding member of the first Fed board, and Benjamin Strong, the head of the New York Fed. Their alliance to build a developmental central bank to be able to develop a reputable money market in New York, using open market operations by subsidizing dealers. And they're looking at the right bank for them. The second model is the regional bankers model, which is, a banker's bank that helps them find liquidity, manages their risk, a clientelistic model where the bankers are the dominant actor. And here the Bank of England is the model. And the third and the fourth models are the treasury agent model, which the populist alliance of the Democrats with the treasury support, trying to dominate through the board of these New York and other reserve bankers. And here, obviously, the sovereign right to intervene in markets become the dominant sort of logic. And of course, there's this sort of story of the Irving Fisher and his desire to build a money manager. But for this period, this is not really that important, this actor. By 1919, what we get is, in the paper we describe these politics that result in this alliance building, but a sort of a deal where the New York Treasury and regional bankers develop an operational consensus where basically New York gets its open market operations to subsidize dealers, the Treasury gets New York to become its agent and support the Treasury market, and the bankers bank get their liquidations agenda. Of course, the first time this consensus, this equilibrium is operationalized, it coincides with the crime of 1920, which at the time was called the Great Depression, where by some measures the situation in the economy was worse than the Great Depression of 1930, actually. And New York Fed and other parts of the Fed were put through almost 2 months of congressional hearings in 1920, which they got essentially traumatized. Benjamin Strong had to testify for over 40 hours by the Congress. And And we argue that this was a turning point for our story because they realized that the consensus they had built within the Fed was not politically sustainable. Here, Arthur Miller, the board member, Strong's ally, sort of articulates this, but he basically says that the Federal Reserve System cannot make a business situation, but it can do an immense deal to make the extremes less pronounced and violent. Essentially, the liquidations agenda is not sustainable, so they have to find an alternative to that. And the solution becomes to bring in a new actor into the alliance, the National Bureau of Economic Research, who's at the time trying to build an alternative paradigm for managing economic depressions and trying to bring in New York Fed as its agent. And in this new model, instead of doing liquidationism, you build a new alliance between the NBER economists, Treasury, and the Warburg-Strong's alliance against the reserve bankers, where you try to intervene in depressions to make them less pronounced. All right, so this is basically the evidence we draw from mostly about. I'm going to move forward, but the correspondences between these two parties, which basically shows us that there is this ongoing concern to be able to address this political vulnerability and find new operational logic to the central bank. This is Wesley Mitchell, who's basically pondering on how this could be done in 1921. And this dinner that Mitchell attends in Strong's house, where basically Strong discloses the new discoveries he has made, the new innovations he has developed. Right. So I'm going to pass this, but so the concluding, as far as to conclude, beyond this sort of historical moment, this historical reinvention moment, I think it's really interesting to look at this moment because it shows us the kind of social compact upon which the Fed was built as an institution. It was a compact that promised to deliver public interest, public benefits, while reconciling the private interests of Wall Street with the state's interest in terms of creation of a new dollar. And in that sense, I think some of the dynamics we see today are actually showing us the limits of this social compact. Because to deliver these public benefits, you need more and more bailouts, because this way of governing relies on finance, results in growth of money markets, the enhancement of systemic risks, and to be able to make it more sustainable, it's endemic to how we govern the economy. Therefore, it's kind of a moment to rethink about how to recompose the social compact with the bankers. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Christina Laskaridis. She's a lecturer in economics at the School of Social Sciences and Global Studies at the Open University in the UK, and a fellow at St. Edmund Hall and St. Business School at Oxford.
Okay. Okay? Yeah? No? I'll just speak maybe properly now. Okay. So thanks everybody for being here, and thank you for having me. Congratulations to the organizers, and thanks in advance to our discussant. This is really a paper kind of with a backdrop of the unfolding debt crisis that is going on today that we've heard about. And it's really about the sort of multiple comparisons that have been going on with the 1980s. which was a avoidable development disaster. And that crisis provoked a very voluminous literature on the sort of policy response, the kind of errors in the policy response, that has been dealt with extensively. And this paper is really about a sort of understudied aspect of all that, which is the evolution of how economists at the time thought about economics of sovereign debt, and in particular, sort of modelling default. So the crisis provoked, as most crises do, rethinking of various intellectual sort of traditions, bringing people together from different methodological standing points. And that really marked the beginning of what's called the new economics of sovereign debt, sort of where we go back to today when we say, these models, that's when they started. So this is a theoretical and applied literature, and it builds on a sort of range of traditions from general equilibrium theory, growth theory, very importantly game theory, bringing in things like penalties, strategic considerations in lending and repudiating. It's also important to note the sort of overarching transformation of the economics discipline at the time, and the sort of raging war about the role of debts and deficits in the economy happening in macro. So this is a bit of a zoom in into a number of these issues. Just a sort of foreground, like why does it matter how economists conceive of that problem? Very relevant to what we've been talking about is how important the conceptions of money are within the economic discipline. Is also how they've been formalized in economic theory. So I want to explore more closely the sort of way that default itself has been formalized, and to sort of draw our attention to, I guess, what Keynes talked about, sort of madmen in authority and those academic scribblers, and how we can sort of link those two. How do those academic scribblers actually end up having any sort of importance? And one of the ways that that's been looked at is through this whole range of literatures that look at the sort of power of economists and economics in the public sphere, how they provide the language of policy, how they help maintain reputation standards and sort of covers in international organizations, how a lot of that authority actually stems from the sort of nature of the economics profession itself, sort of hierarchical nature, and helping to spread what Berman has called the sort of economic style of reasoning, a sort of very successful way of doing that. And mostly I think what's important for our purposes is that there's a certain power and privilege that comes over being able to frame a problem in a certain way, helping us think about how it's analysed. So I'm drawing here also from the work of Mary Morgan, who sort of looks at models as like little worlds to help us reason about the big world. We talked a lot about puzzles. Sovereign debt is very much sort of defined by a puzzle, which I'll go into in a minute. The sort of models help us reason about puzzles. They help us tell stories. Economists are quite sort of elaborate storytellers in some respect. And we talked a lot in the first day about narratives, and effectively models are ways of helping us say a narrative about the economy. And so that's a way of assessing relevance. So I'm not saying that the formal world has to resemble the real world, but what happens in the narrative of the model is that you use that to sort of say, is this actually relevant? So the sovereign debt puzzle, for those who work in sovereign debt, it's very much defined by a puzzle. That's how it's phrased in the literature. And to paraphrase somebody who I've learned an awful lot from, Anna Gelpen, the two distinctive features of the sovereign debt puzzle are so well rehearsed in the literature they don't even strike anyone as weird anymore. And one of those two features, one is that sovereign debt contracts are unenforceable, meaning there's very little that can be done, so the puzzle says, to make governments pay if they don't. This is despite the erosion of sovereign immunity that's happened over time. There's very little that a foreign court can do to actually seize assets in the domestic national economy. Small aside, this is a picture where that did happen, the blockade of the port of Piraeus in the middle of the 19th century in Greece, blockaded by the French and British troops following a default of the early 19th century, terminated on condition of a financial commission to examine the lack of payment. So, end of aside. Second main part of the puzzle is there's no resolution mechanism, there's no guarantee by matter of right to a fresh start. And so this has sort of led to the very multi-decade discussion around the need for a sort of framework to provide fair, efficient, timely restructuring, sort of reconfiguring international architecture to actually provide positive solutions for debtors who find themselves unable to repay. So the literature has really formed itself around this question. So why do sovereigns pay if it's unenforceable and there's nowhere to start again? So I'm going to sort of go back to the sort of canonical, what's been talked as canonical. The forming of a canon is itself quite a controversial thing in economics, but let's just, for the sake of argument, call these canonical. Theorists to address the debt crisis, the sort of origin story of what we call about where this comes from. And this is far from exhaustive. But I just want to summarize some of the ways of reasoning that were embedded in these models. So just starting with Eaton and Gersovich, both students of Token at MIT, defined their model, debt with potential repudiation, as formally acknowledged as the starting point of that modeling of default, sovereign default. They introduced an infinite horizon model. The borrower is assumed to produce stochastic variable output, which takes on various rate values. There's an amount that's available for consumption, and there's also a penalty, which is taken away from that if the borrower can't repay. So in each period, the borrower has a choice to pay or to not pay. There's also a repayment function, which basically decides how much of that debt will be repaid in each period. So it's a sort of marginal cost, marginal benefit argument. Default will be optimal if the value of default is greater than the marginal benefit of repaying. So what determines that is really whether you have a high income or a low income. So in a low income environment, the sort of marginal benefit of that extra income means more than in times of great income. So in this context, what they help establish is this idea that sovereigns repay because of reputational reasons to basically avoid being stranded out of international capital markets. So I've just been warned for time, so I'm just going to basically go to the main sort of answer to that, which was by Özgöde and Roni at the end there, who suggested instead that the disincentive for repudiation is not really the penalty, it's actually being excluded from trade. So they set up a small open economy that has sort of tradable perishable goods. And it's really a bargaining solution over debt contracts. They don't use the mechanism of penalty, they use bargaining in a sort of game theoretical framework to set up a game between a country and a bank. And the sort of region that becomes the solution to the model is the one that basically allows trade to take place. So effectively, the rationale is that why do sovereigns repay? Because they don't want to avoid trade sanctions. So just some conclusions, just sort of summarizing some of that. These are real models, there are non-monetary variables in there. Sort of consumption smoothing is a form of real activity. Sort of insights about strategic behavior coming from game theory. There's a sort of game theoretic way of finding a solution. Bankruptcy costs exist, decisions are made under uncertainty, risks are uninsurable. But modeling default itself is sort of an innovation, partly because it breaks with the core of neoclassical macro at the time, which is basically based on the countersality condition, the known Ponzi scheme. By assumption, all debts are repaid. So one part of my paper is really to sort of just update and sort of enrich our origin story slightly by basically saying, actually, modeling default existed prior to this moment. And that's important because they also, those prior moments actually enabled some sort of slightly alternative form of modeling strategies, paths that were not taken in some respect. So I've listed some of those papers there. I'm just going to focus a little bit on the final ones. The work by Martin Schubeck and Wilson, who also sort of model default as an optimal decision. And this is sort of based on some archival work that I'm doing in the papers of Schubeck and Modigliani, who is also looking at this. And how they try to really include a model, sort of optimal decision of default as part of the theory of money and a concern about credit debt and its non-repayment. So here's a little quote about how he started onto this, talking to his supervisor, Oscar Morgenstern, about need for a decent theory of money. And the reason was because he wanted to include the idea of nominal as opposed to just real frictions in the model. And the reason why that's important, and I think this is maybe what will come to in the discussion, is that how you model something produces quite different types of effects and therefore calls for quite different policy responses, including impacts about wealth and inequality. The other thing is that different modelling strategies have quite different outcomes for what might be an optimal bankruptcy resolution. So the idea that you might have different means of resolving debt crises that emerge from model outcomes, as opposed to the ones that we have today. So going back to the initial question of why should we care, or what are the implications of how economists model the world, has sort of to do with the narrative that we form. The why pay approach, sort of answering that kind of a question, has fundamentally transformed the problem as looking as one from sort of an ability to pay to one of willingness. And that marks a fundamental change to how ability to repay sort of sovereign debt had been analysed until that time, which was sort of very much embedded in the literature of structural change in capital and sort of development economics, sort of traditional development economics of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So with new techniques and tools, the sort of way that the problem was theorised was changed, and the argument given, this is just one quote, an indication, was that it's not the ability to pay that's the constraining factor here that stops countries from paying, it's willingness. And we heard a lot in the previous panel, and I think that's what I want to just add on here, is that this preference of willingness over ability is totally questionable if you just consider, I think I heard 60% of sort of government revenue being used in the name of debt service. There are many other examples of close to a third or a half of a government's budget or export earnings being used in that name. So question of ability here, as well as like priorities over different types of creditors, being hugely important. So I don't want to get into economics bashing at all, but there are some ways of thinking that change fundamentally, which is the whole notion of the long run in this model is sort of changed. So we go from basically thinking of long run structural change to intertemporal maximisation as a concept of the long run. There's a very sort of specific conception of how resources are actually used for debt service. Where do they come from? Krugman himself, in that paper, criticises this black box approach. We just assume resources come out of a black box. And there are modelling options that allow for zero domestic consumption. So you have a modelling possibility in there, which basically assumes that all of the resources available will be used for that service, which is like very morally, sort of ethically questionable. The power imbalances that take place in the sort of negotiations and the games that are set up are really sort of analysed through game theory, but there's no way of sort of inputting an inequality story between the different negotiating parties. I think game theory can do that, but in this context it's not. I think the last point is just a sort of implication for how we see default. Again, this is something that I really resonated with in the previous panel. There's not much room to think of the good reasons to default, and the sort of possible economic functions that default might have. There's no way of conceiving, so the way that it's conceived of is default is something punishable, if not by death, by some horrible penalty or sanction. And in fact, I think what would be more useful is actually thinking of modelling strategies that enable growth-inducing potential to come after a point of default, and possible ways of reorganising that in order to make non-repayment something that can have a positive outcome, which goes back to the sort of surprising countries keep paying for as long as they can, considering the implications of that sometimes. These models also sort of divert attention to other critical issues and theoretical perspectives that have been out there. So even theories from the time, Doherty's theory of loan pushing, things about the structural firepower of finance, and other reasons, specifically the reasons that developing countries themselves are negotiating sort of frameworks like the UNCTAD and particularly the group of 77 countries, were advocating for the root causes behind the debt crisis, protectionism, declining terms of trade, sort of tying up to the development program overall, so you can't separate debt problems from development problems. And just to conclude, one thing I'd just like to end with is this idea that these new techniques ended up sort of changing our focus a little bit away from some of those sort of structural development problems. I think we need to think about what kind of criteria we'd be using if what we were thinking about is ability. ability to pay. And there is a whole host of policy proposals. I've really focused on just some economic models. There's no lack of proposals for actually doing that, both in terms of integrating sort of human rights frameworks and debt repayment schedules, the climate financing of SDGs. There's a number of considerations which really touch upon ability to pay, which would see things in very different light. And one of the sort of, I guess, motivating forces for me for looking at this was that sort of analytical template sort of tied in and dovetailed very closely with the sort of policy solutions given at the time, which was the idea that debt is default of their own sort of failings. And that's what I want to end with. So just thank you for your attention.
Yeah, I'm just going to go here.
So our final speaker is Robert Aber. Oh, sorry, do you say it like that? Anyway, an associate professor of law at Georgia State University. And in case it wasn't, I just wanted to highlight that we are actually all four different disciplines here, and I think that's interesting because a lot of the panels kind of were able to speak in one language, but we have a certain diversity here that I think is also interesting. So political science, sociology, economics, and now law. All right.
Thank you, Roni. Okay, so two prefatory notes. First, I don't have the PowerPoint, so for the PowerPoint mavens, I apologize. Second, this is a panel about inside and outside economics, and my remarks are going to be thoroughly outside of economics. So with this project, I'm using the seize up in the repo markets from September of 2019 as a case study to explore a more general phenomenon of financial crisis, monetary crisis, and crisis response from the central banks. And in particular, I'm interested in working with a few theoretical frames. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we substitute these social theoretical frames for the predominant social theoretical lens that we normally use to analyze these events, namely normative welfare economics. Indeed, it would be impossible to do so insofar as economics plays a real constitutive and performative role in central banking and financial regulation. Normative welfare economics is an example of what Giddens called the double hermeneutic of the social sciences, insofar as it doesn't merely describe the social world, but it acts on the social world as both the subject and the object of its analysis. And according to that neoclassical welfare economics approach to central bank interventions, central banks are identifying a market failure, and we then use economics to assess whether that intervention to correct the failure has the capacity to indeed correct that market failure. The baseline in that framework is usually one of equilibrium. We see evidence of this in the Fed's self-description when it consistently messages these very prosaic comments about its intervention, saying that we're just ensuring smooth market functioning, all the while we're comprehensively reworking the basic institutional infrastructure of the money market. So my project is motivated here by the perception that it might be a right moment to learn something by trying on some new kind of meta-theoretical lenses, new ways of observing what's happening with this dramatic flurry of institutional innovations that have occurred in central banking in recent years. And in preparing these remarks, I've really only got time to discuss one perspective, and so I decided to take a look at what Giorgio Agamben might say about what's happening here. And in particular, I'm wondering whether Agamben's theorization of modern government as a permanent state of exception or a permanent state of emergency might help us to better understand the constant oscillation between crisis and response in modern central banking for the past 2 decades. This group, I assume, has a good degree of familiarity with repo markets and the September 2019 events, so I'm only going to take a few minutes here to refresh your recollection on that. And in doing so, I hope to explain why I find that episode to be illustrative of this broader trend or phenomenon in money markets and central banking practice. So we all are well familiar with what happens with quantitative easing. It effectuates the sort of residue of quantitative easing is that there's a qualitative transformation on the Fed's balance sheet. It expands the balance sheet expanded several-fold, and the amount of reserves in the system expanded several hundred-fold. And as a result, the old monetary policy toolkit just never really worked anymore. It used to rely on reserve scarcity, and now we are in conditions of reserve abundance. The Fed therefore created a new system of what are called administered rates to influence the short-term interest rate environment. It was most focused in maintaining the interest rate floor, less focused on the ceiling. And it developed two tools: interest on reserve balances for the banks and overnight reverse repurchase facility for the shadow banks. This system was pretty effective in maintaining the floor of the interest rates, and there wasn't a lot of upward pressure, so no one noticed that. But in September of 2019, interest rates in the repo market, which is by far the most important dollar funding market, spiked dramatically, with the average price doubling overnight. Some transactions were concluded 4 to 5 times the target rate, 4 to 5 times the prevailing rate the day before, which was just above the Fed funds target rate, because these are very, in normal circumstances, of course, these are linked at the hip. And so overnight, the Fed learned that reserves had become scarce again, despite the fact that there were several trillions of them in the system. And the troubles in the repo market transmitted quickly to the Fed funds market, as banks with reserve surpluses directed their lending to the repo market, where they could get 2, 3, 4 times the amount of return. The consequence of that was that the Fed funds rate then broke through the upper bound of the target range. And the all-powerful central bank had lost control of the one thing that is most institutionally committed to maintaining, the Fed funds rate. It appeared that reserve scarcity had reemerged, but unlike before, when the demand for reserves was sort of predictable, quantifiable, based on the aggregate reserve requirements of the banking industry, the central bank had a limited or maybe even non-existent ability to predict when this reserve scarcity would arise once again. What was the Fed's response? Well, it reacted quickly and replenished the system with reserves via a new standing repo facility, which has now become an ongoing feature of the central bank's monetary policy toolkit, an open-ended promise to inject reserves whenever required via this new facility. As for the causality of the repo episode, it's almost certainly overdetermined. Also, there's a whole network of different plausible accounts for why this happened, and undoubtedly they all played a role. But I want us to kind of step back a bit and look at this meta model of crisis leading to response, leading to crisis, leading to another response, sort of this oscillatory phenomenon that I want to get us to maybe play around with a bit. So the basic idea here is that we have a crisis in the form of anemic growth following during the Great Recession. We have an emergency response in the form of quantitative easing, an asset-based Keynesianism, in order to keep the economy afloat. Then we have that leading to a new crisis, namely the Fed can't maintain control of the interest rate using its tools. It needs to react on the fly to invent new ones. We have a new emergency response in the form of the standing repo facility, and so forth. Who knows what's next? And so here's where I think Agamben might possibly shed some light for us. He's, of course, one of the most influential political and legal thinkers of the 21st century. And as I was learning more about, this project started with me learning a lot about the September repo episode. But as I learned more about it, I kept coming back to Agamben. He writes about how emergency powers by sovereign governments, which he refers to as powers exercised during the state of exception, following Schmidt. These emergency powers have become increasingly normal technologies of modern government. While the state of exception was originally conceived as a sort of provisional measure of government, meant to cope with an immediate danger in order to restore the normal situation, for Agamben, the state of emergency or exception today constitutes a permanent technology of government. Further, he traces a shift in the focus on the part of modern governments. As sovereign power becomes increasingly occupied with protecting life in the 17th century and beyond, exercising what Foucault called biopower, it focused initially on the causes of peril to life, things like famines and wars and disasters. But according to Agamben, in modernity, the focus of government shifts away from the causes of perils and attempts to control their effects, as a sort of risk manager. And this axiom applies to every domain, from the economy to the ecology, from from foreign and military politics to the internal measures of police. Agamben thinks that governments today have largely given up on attempts to rule causes and instead focus on managing effects. And of course, the state of exception is a simple way to justify interventions to control the effects of crisis. The state of exception, according to Agamben, suspends the rule of law, is therefore an exception to the rule of law. And when the sovereign decides that an emergency or a crisis or state of exception exists, the sovereign can then invoke extra legal powers. In the medical tradition, the term crisis, which is a key term that Agamben uses here in this connection, refers to the moment when the doctor decides whether a patient will survive or will die. We can think of it as a moment of temporal disjuncture. Now, Agamben says that the moment of crisis is no longer temporally bound at all and is instead a permanent fixture. He writes that crisis coincides with normality. The state of exception has become the norm. Okay, so that is a whirlwind through just a little bit of Agamben's political theory. What can this how can this shed some light on what happened in the repo market in 2019 and central banking practice more generally? Well, I think we might think about whether in modern central banking, the basis for designating exceptional last resort authorities and in extremis powers on the part of the central bank, or in other words, distinguishing between the exceptional and the ordinary, is eroding. Confusion results from the situation, with many commentators, I think perfectly reasonably, remarking on the extraordinary reinvention of the basic forms of central bank control over money markets and financial markets, as well as the open-ended largesse and providing central bank money to all comers. But at the same time, other commenters, I think also correctly, note that the Federal Reserve is technically speaking just simply exercising its humdrum authorities under Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act. It's using open market operations to influence the interest rate environment. And this sort of humdrum description of the intervention is not, strictly speaking, inaccurate, although we might say that it misses something important. So when the Fed sort of ritualistically incants that it's just smoothing the market functioning so that it can hit its interest rate target, in the process it's pushing through a flurry of institutional innovations that exercise real power on real people with clear distributive effects on and so forth. So I think that this kind of destabilizes the legal framework and the political compromises over generations that are predicated on the distinction between extraordinary action on the part of the central bank and normal, ordinary course operations. For instance, if the Federal Reserve is continually invoking unusual and exigent circumstances authority under Section 13(3) of the Federal Reserve Act, or if the on the other hand, if the Federal Reserve Act continues to use this normal, everyday Section 14 open market authority to effectuate really exceptional transformations of the institutional environment or validations of certain types of money and credit flows, it starts to appear to be claiming to act in service of a state of exception outside of those legal and political settlements. Last thought here is that there's a relationship here between the state of exception and a declining vitality of democracy in modern societies, according to Agamben. So Agamben relies on a passage from the Swedish political scientist Herbert Tingsten, who wrote that the systematic and regular exercise of emergency powers by modern governments necessarily leads to a liquidation of democracy. And I thought about this yesterday at our plenary session, where we had some discussion about how reliance on the central bank as a crisis resolver absolves the responsibility of the elected branches of government and operates to delegitimate fiscal policies, a steering mechanism. We were drawing then on Agamben themes without mentioning his name. Are there levers of public power to democratically activate by which we could restructure financialized capitalism? To pick up on the earlier discussion between the government's focus on causes and effects, can we reorient democratic government to engage in the causes of the crisis? Or is the incessant idiom and social fact of crisis somehow shunting democratic reform efforts to the side as the central bank arrives on the spot with an ever bigger fire hose of liquidity support? As the powerful Fed, maker of new financial worlds, the transformer of a multi-trillion-dollar balance sheet overnight, left any room for politics at all? I think it's worth at least contemplating.
Great. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, super. I'll just be quick. I'm going to try and leave some room for questions. I know we're getting close to time, but I wanted to thank the organizers. Great to see many of you remotely. Great to see Sanoy, and the panelists for excellent papers. This was a lot of fun. So the title of our session is Money in and Out of Economics, which is partly a confession that we're covering a lot of ground across these papers. But I think that's as much a feature as a bug. And as Roni said, the different disciplinary perspectives actually help us sort of foreground the different ways that we're thinking about money, both as a theoretical object and as a something like an artifact in practice. So cognizant of time, let me just offer a few broad questions for all the panelists, something that I wanted folks to think about. And then I won't reprise the papers here in any depth. We've just heard from the speakers ourselves, but I'll focus on a couple questions that might be useful for each paper. So, and you can respond however you see fit. So the thing that I was interested in about all papers was, first, where's money in your account? In what ways is it in economics, that is, inside a theoretical framework or intellectual construct? And in what ways is it out of such a frame, whether it's in government policy, in social practices, or business activity? Second, are there ways that the ways that money is in and out related? How are the ways that money is in and out related? Do the theorizations of money affect its operation in practice, and if so, how? Or do the practices in some way alter theory on your account, or some back and forth? And finally, I think with a nod to the conference itself, could there be a reframing of money, whether it's in or out of economics on your account, to become, or at least partly become, a democratic medium, whatever that might mean? What could that mean, or should it mean, and what would that shift require? So those are some of the broad thoughts I had thinking about them all together. Let me give a few quick comments, questions on each paper. Let me start with Roni's paper, since it comes first chronologically, but also because its theoretical focus helps to set forward some themes that might draw through to the other papers. So one of Roni's central claims is that the theorization of interest as a kind of abstinence brought time into classical political economy. In what way is this view of time in economics different from the way that time is brought in through the analysis of production as such? So you consider the opening line in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which begins with the labor fund. Quote, "The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and conveniences of life, which it annually consumes." Emphasis on the annual here, right? Both labor and consumption are understood as processes taking place in time. I think Smith is borrowing from physiocracy, in effect shifting the flow that happens in Quesnay's Tableau économique from grain to labor. But it's basically a thought of a process or a flow in time. So what does thinking about abstinence add to that picture? Onur's paper on the invention of macroeconomic governance in the Fed suggests a new style of central banking that emerged as a kind of settlement among different interests in and visions for the Fed, which then became central to the construction of the American and by extension, the world economy. This is a most fascinating story in itself, but I think where he wants to push it in the final pages toward a discussion of how socio-technical practices make the economy what it is, made me wonder whether, Onur, you think there's something about banking or money, and if so, what, that gives it that constructive power, or whether you think all practices potentially have that reshaping capacity under the right circumstances. To frame this in terms of an older Marxist lexicon, what were the constraints, if any, on how the Fed remade itself? Is it relatively autonomous? Is it radically autonomous vis-a-vis some of the other background material structures or interests? You dropped the great man economic innovator account, I think wisely, but do you assume in its place a kind of great practices or great role account, which assumes a view of banking, however much what the Fed came up with may be an internal policy compromise, as autonomous from the economy such that it can remake it? I noted the references to Latour, and I can't help asking about this underlying socioeconomic ontology assumed, and whether it might persist in a kind of attenuated voluntarism even while it shifts the idea of the agent and of the will. And that, of course, matters. Why? Because your concluding thoughts on a new central banking compact today would have implications for that. Christina's paper on sovereign debt, it's a great and thoughtful review of the new analytic models used to understand sovereign debt crises. Let me just turn to the interesting remarks on model building at the end of the paper. What's left in, what's left out, and how much of that is inherent or intrinsic to the model and how much extrinsic. So on page 34, you write about these models. There's an obfuscation of the conflict between adjustment and default. The model's treatment of the lack of resources for domestic consumption, where in the case of zero leftover, the country would starve, are ethically, politically, and socially questionable modeling possibilities. And I certainly agree with that. What I'm wondering about is whether that inattention is in any way intrinsic to the model once selected, or is there the possibility of modeling this problem within the analytic frames that the models build out, and you show us they build out. I think this matters because if there's no room for these different questions to be modeled, then of course critical scrutiny of the model is necessary. But if there is, then why they didn't get modeled in would be the relevant question. That might have to do with power or politics or God knows what. I also just have to put in a plug for my former classmate's book, Peter Spiegler, Behind the Model, A Constructive Critique of Economic Modeling. It's a fantastic book that takes off from Mary Morgan's book and from her work, and I thought of it while reading your paper. Finally, Robert, your very fascinating discussion of 3 ways of looking at the Fed's repo facility. Let me just jump to the end. It looks like the 3 ways generalize from Agamben, from Luhmann, and from Minsky. And it's perhaps unfair, but also predictable, of course, to want more from the suggestive but admittedly unfinished ending. I want to know whether you yourself had a kind of hybrid view in mind that sees intermittent Agambenian declarations of a state of exception as a kind of Luhmannian social system that depends on Minskyan validation by the state agency. So could you sort of mix these 3 frames up? So you don't have 3 ways of looking at the repo, but 1 way really. And if that's right, and I think that might be where you're going, I wanted to know whether you think there's any external constraint to that self-validating logic of crisis and system. I'm of course asking not for myself, but for an investor friend. Thank you very much.
All right, so in the interest of time, we'll just take any questions people have, and then we'll do a lightning round of responses.
Hi, this was a wonderful presentation. I have a question for Robert about the Agamben framework and whether it fits and maybe an alternative. I mean, the Agamben idea of being outside all law and totally unconstrained and that it reveals a sovereign sits a little uneasily with how I understand the Federal Reserve has acted, which goes way beyond its normal boundaries, but doesn't. I mean, Congress has revisited the Fed's mandate and changed its legal authorities, and there are moments where it's had to restrain itself. So I'm wondering about an alternative idea that's, I think, more consistent with the way we think of most emergencies, especially in the presidential context, which is that people claim that they are doing something unusual or slightly illegal or unorthodox, but it's temporary. You know, they're just trying to restore the status quo ante, and they'll give up these powers as soon as possible. That's Lincoln's idea, right? I'm not gonna mess with slavery. I really don't like presidential power. And they take measures that are unusual and extraordinary. The Emancipation Proclamation, suspending habeas corpus. But they're often half measures. They are limited in a lot of ways. And then events push them and push them and push them until, you know, there's no going back, right? The presidency is transformed, the Constitution is transformed, and that seems to be what's happened with the Federal Reserve as well. I don't think they really intended to be sovereign and assert control all power. They ended up having to expand their authorities farther and farther so that, and even as they claimed they were doing something that was legal, they were lending, not spending, they weren't picking winners and losers, and we know that's just not true. But that seems like a very different story in which they're being pushed, and they have agency, but they're not totally sovereign and outside all law. That there's law still playing a role there.
So thank you for a wonderful panel and commentation, really brilliant. But a specific question for Roni, you mentioned time, and it's kind of there in Adam Smith, but it's not really there till later. And I'm wondering if the inside-outside question is time inside the economy or outside, or does it have anything to do with money? Because it seems like it's ephemerally present, but not explicitly mentioned in many ways. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I found this panel very interesting, very cohesive. My question is for Christina, and it sort of builds on one of David's questions a bit, so I'll try to be very fast. I think in my, I'm a young scholar, I've taken these models as a high point of critique for a long time, and I really enjoyed your presentation. But over time, one of the questions from sort of a theory of change perspective, and I would like to hear your response, and again, this builds on David's question. Is this the kind of thing, where like a heterodox economist could come in and change the model, or come in with a different approach than modeling altogether and change the policy? Or, is this really the thing where those models are serving sort of a status quo reality that are, bringing debt flows from the global south to the global north, and really a very, obviously neo-colonial situation, and is it the kind of thing where you think that power will have to be disrupted, that this isn't the kind of thing where an economist can sort of come in and change the policies, change the models, change the world, where really there'll have to be like subversive alliances, social unrest, and other ways of subverting power.
Thanks for a very rich panel. I'll limit my questions to Robert's paper and the Agamben frame, which I think both fits and doesn't fit, because if I understand it, the crisis, the exception of the Agamben frame is exogenous, but the Minskian idea, of course, is that, and this goes back to Bagehot, Hawtrey, and so on, is that the system is endogenously unstable. And if the system is endogenously unstable and complex and tending to instability over time, as a technical matter, you need, the crisis is kind of building up all the time, and there's going to be a point of resolution to that crisis, and it's just like your computer needs a reset every time, or periodically, right? It's a kind of technical feature of an inherently unstable system. So that's the kind of non-Agamben bit, more the Minsky bit, but the Agamben frame can come in because that moment is, of course, then deeply politicized. And that political actors of various kinds, this is happening in the kind of teeth of a political struggle, and there's different stakeholders, winners and losers, out of both the upside, the way up to the crisis and how the crisis is resolved. And so that can then be, that sort of technical feature of the system can then be levered in one way or the other. And there you can see a kind of more Agamben frame. But a pure, this idea that the source of the crisis is endogenous and that the system is not just being reset from the outside, I think is, in tension with Agamben.
All right, I think we'll just do a very quick round of responses and maybe take 2 minutes extra. Yes.
Thanks a lot for those comments, David, and from the audience. Just quickly, I think they are related to questions. I think the quest for a better model is going to be sort of a perennial objective of any kind of discipline, whether it's formal modeling or whether it's just a conception of the world that's somehow codified. So I think that's a kind of normal evolutionary aspect of people working on different subjects. So the better model, I think we heard a lot of better models yesterday in that panel that was talking all about better models, which kind of have different ways of thinking about money and debt. So I think there are better and worse in the context of capturing sort of the implications and the richness that these models do exclude. And I think the purpose is not just to show, you know, how bad those models are. I think perhaps one of the more interesting questions is to see how do they dovetail with a sort of understanding of the debt problem in a policy context. And going back to your question about, you know, what would it take to have a sort of change? One of the things I've looked at, and I've published a paper called Refusing to Improve, it's sort of, why don't we have a better resolution mechanism for sovereign debt repayment problems? And I sort of traced the sort of demands of developing countries over time and how they were sort of perennially put down. And it wasn't just a policy demand, it was also a demand for a better form of economic analysis that would kind of correspond to a policy demand. And there's no exclusion of modelling from the policy demand of developing countries. It's just a policy, it's just a form of economic analysis that would correspond to a more debt-friendly resolution. So one that would maybe focus on external causes of debt crisis and not just domestic management, and one that would sort of have, would embed within it some of the broader things. And I think the conflict that I've sort of traced is how the form of economic analysis that corresponds to the current regime, that sort of debt resolution, is one that's very much focused on this, with the sort of IMF approach to the sort of short-run balance payments gap. And so that way of thinking governs how a debt problem is seen. So yeah, I think you can have corollary economic types of theorizing which would correspond to better policies. Absolutely, and there's been multiple of those sort of proposals over time. And the final point on the democratization question by David, I think this corresponds very much to what would a more democratic process look like. And I think that really stems from the kind of, well, what are the problems that we see today? There's sort of all of these intercreditor conflicts. You don't have good, timely, efficient, fair resolution techniques. So there are a number of ways to democratize how debt crises are resolved, and that's the sort of direction that I would see the sort of kind of response to your democratizing question. So I hope that's okay. Thanks.
Okay, so quite briefly, I think the link between the time of abstinence and the time of production, basically if you look at what John Ray is doing, he's coming up with this amazing theory that links together all the different times, all the different temporalities of actual physical production. So labor embodied is measured in time, and labor commanded is measured in time, and there's a time lapse between labor embodied and labor commanded. Anyway, all that, it's masterful. But the point is, it's a theory of physical time, of physical things that take time to mature and to come to fruition. Whereas abstinence is a second order of analysis, and it's kind of building off of Margaret Chabas, who shows that Mill kind of is the kind of inflection point where economic science can be seen to move to a plane that is a lot more about mental processes, about utilities rather than physical goods. And so abstinence refers to temporalities of an internal drama, that the final verdict of which is a certain level of investment. So abstinence, that's why Ray doesn't have a theory of abstinence. He just has a theory of waiting, and I'm still trying to understand, but I think the important aspect. Right, Mill will take it back to the physical because he ultimately is concerned by the problem of overpopulation, and this drama in the capitalist mind feeds into that, but I won't get more into that. And then, yeah, what is time doing outside of economics? And I really think it's a really interesting question, and I've been thinking a lot about this with this chapter on time, and I really can't quite decide if time is productive or corrosive. When Mill says all wealth is new, he says all wealth is constantly being consumed to even constitute wealth. So I really tend to think that for these economists, time has this is a corrosive force ultimately, where capitalism would be that the thing that is productive over time. Yeah, I won't say more.
Okay, I'll be brief. Two really interesting questions. As to the first one, Yeah, reading Agamben is really a disorienting experience because you periodically perceive that he's onto something really profound, and then at the same time you're wondering, is this all just is he just being dramatic and hysterical? But he says things like the ultimate expression of modern government is the extermination camp, right? And this book that he wrote in 2005, State of Exception, was written in response to the Patriot Act and the complete mobilization of the security apparatus, the aftermath of 9/11. And clearly something different is happening with central banking, don't get me wrong. But I do wonder, I think that the way that we can apply that insight that he's onto something about modern government is to note that it's true that, between 1930s and 2008, the Fed never invoked Section 13.3, and suddenly it's become quite routine. The unusual and exigent circumstance has become routine. And does that operate to erode a bit of the commitment, the rule of law? Sure, that you can point to Section 13.3, which was enacted pursuant to a constitutional regime of lawmaking. But if we're constantly using it and invoking the legalized exception, does that over time start to erode our commitment to the rule of law more generally? I also think that it bears mention, I'm reminded of a comment that I think Nathan Tankus made last night at the plenary, which is that real people died on account of the institutional design of the municipal lending facility in March of 2020. I think it's worth thinking about, as the Fed designs these crisis response, as the Fed rolls out this unprecedented QE program, what were the alternative sorts of political projects that were implicitly left aside that could have perhaps led to fewer people dying? I think it's important to bear in mind the kind of biopolitical reality of Federal Reserve policy. And so maybe it's not entirely hysterical to compare it to Guantanamo or these sorts of more extreme direct interventions onto citizens' well-being. And then as to, it's Anush, right? Anush's comment, which really dovetails with David, I think I need to think through exactly, in the paper I talk about Minsky and Agamben, I need to think through how to link those two stories together. I think I'm most interested in Minsky in this connection. Not as a post-Keynesian economist, but instead kind of as an institutionalist economist. So I'm not interested so much in financial instability, but instead his notion of validation and the idea that when the government bails out an institution, they are validating a set of institutional arrangements. And so it therefore becomes kind of an exogenous political event that's decided by a sovereign, some organ of the sovereign government in the form of the central bank, that becomes the state of exception. And so I'm less interested in the sort of financial instability process. What about it?
I think on that important point.
Okay. So I guess I'll respond to some of David's questions. They're quite extensive questions. But to start with, where's the money? I guess the way I think of the money is a political legal layer, and upon which the central bank and other governance institutions are sort of established and plugged into. So this leaves the question of the theorization of money. Where is it in the theory? I actually think that it's better to think of, rather than think of theory or practice, it's to think of the central bank or other governance institutions as a set of networks that bring together different theories and practices. The question becomes then, whose network design can extend and become stable, given that they have to plug themselves into other networks that already exist in society? So in terms of the democratization question, I think it's better to ask which network can actually form a consensus better than the other. And I think that gives us the answer to why the strong network ended up winning, both against the bankers, reserve bankers, but also against the Keynesians at the end. because the Keynesian machinery, the network that was built after with the New Deal, started to run into all sorts of problems precisely because the elements of the network, namely the Congress, could not build a consensus along with the bills that were being sent from Council of Economic Advisors. And whereas the Federal Reserve, precisely because it was built in such a way that it was compromised between all these constituent elements of the Federal Reserve, which included the bankers themselves, right? So by the time the FOMC makes a decision on the OMOs, on the interest rate, that you have basically, whether different factions of the banking sector agree to it or not, they have come to a consensus, and once they vote on it, it's all done. The struggle gets postponed to the next decision. Whereas in Congress, that could not have happened. So I think it's better to think of this question in terms of sort of how do you build longer and longer networks in the Arthurian sense. But that, of course, raises this question of do we shift to a voluntarism of the techniques? I don't necessarily think so, because the ability to extend the network depends on the agency of the actors that are trying to extend the network in the first place. And that's why it's so important for those actors to be able to build autonomy through different performances, like David Carpenter's work in this extent is very interesting. So it's a contingent event, but it's also sort of over time becomes over-determined precisely because you're building these networks in the longer run.
I'd like to thank the panelists for our discussions and all of you. Wow, it really rained.
Thanks for being
Yeah, thanks.
very
Well,